Welcome to the presentation entitled Engaging Students in Black Lives Matter and Civil Rights, a panel discussion. Oops. I want to welcome you to this breakout session. My name is Jennifer Ripley. I'm professor of psychology at Regent University and the moderator of this presentation. Today you'll be hearing from several presenters that I'll introduce in a moment. If your session was granted CEs, so I do not know at this time whether or not we are granted CEs, but if, please consult your program for that. If so, you will earn 1 CE for attendance of the whole presentation. CE evaluation forms will be sent to you after the conference by email, so you can verify your attendance and provide feedback. During the presentation, you are able to enter in discussion via the chat feature, and you're welcome to take advantage of this opportunity to interact during the presentation. Thank you for your attendance. I will introduce to you our presenters briefly. Dr. Cassandra Page and Dr. Hannah Jones are professors at Regent University in the Doctor of Psychology program. They both have specialties in areas of diversity as part of their work, among other things. David Wang at Biola University is also well known for his work in diversity and is also affiliated with the Doctor of Psychology program there. Samuel Girguis, excuse me, at Azusa Pacific University is a professor in their PsyD program. You will also be hearing from Winston Seegobin at George Fox University and John McConnell at Wheaton College. All of our presenters have expertise in diversity as psychologists, and they also are working as mentors and professors in their programs as we walk through the experience of Black Lives Matter movement and civil rights. You will see more information about the presentation in your program that I have here. We're first going to hear from Cassandra, Dr. Cassandra Page, and she's going to talk with us a little bit about her experience.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Jen. So Black Lives Matter and its impact on college students has been nothing short of significant, and for varying reasons. With its recent resurgence due to Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd's deaths last year, I really hate to say resurgence when I talk about these things, and even new civil rights movement, because it seems as though the movement actually never really stopped. The 60s are not considered history to me because most people who were born then are still alive. I was raised by people born in the 60s. So that's the foundational perspective that I'm bringing to today's panel, that today in 2020 and years past are really just simply extensions of this movement for civil rights to be applied equitably that must still come to pass. The movement that simply asks for all lives to matter. Having this framework is a more liberal mindset compared to that of some of my students. There are questions regarding the need for continued marching and protests because things that happened way back then are not really happening now. And if they're happening now, they're few and far between. There are also questions regarding the legitimacy of Black Lives Matter. Like, why should we focus on one group of people, particularly an organization that participates in violence, looting, and happens to be anti-cop, anti-white, anti-Christian, and anti-American? Where's my part in this? And why are you forcing this on me? And then others, students of color, Black students, they'll turn to me, sometimes looking to me for guidance of some sort. Is she gonna say anything? Maybe I'll respond if she addresses it. Some turn protective. I just don't want you to get in trouble or to be blamed. And then some just completely check out. Things like, I don't have time to sit here and listen to my white peers talk about how Blue Lives Matter to redirect the conversation to their pain while minimizing and completely discounting mine. I'm just not here for it. And then still others want to know how I'm doing, like really doing, while also voicing what position that puts me in as a cisgender Black female teaching at a predominantly white institution. My response is not good without further explanation is deemed unfair because of projections that I potentially have to filter through. It isn't unfair that I can't be real while my colleagues can. It isn't unfair that I can't even comment on that injustice. So these students plea on my behalf, desiring a space for me to feel as I provided to them. That's just how the Wednesday morning in class went after George Floyd was murdered. As faculty advisor to our AB-Sci student circle, I had the opportunity to connect with some student members and process them in a more authentic way later that week. And they were raw. We grieved together and we were able to be human together. And my desire for becoming a psychologist and faculty member was to try and embody representation I coveted during my time in graduate school. I wanted to be a reminder somehow to students who looked like me or saw themselves in me that it was possible for them to reach the other side. I really wanted them to know that my very existence meant that I believed in them, that somebody believed in them. And I wanted these future students to have a more positive experience, one where their voices were heard and experiences were validated. I simply just wanted these future students to be seen. Over the weekend after Mr. Floyd's killing, I felt this urge to speak on their behalf and address the program, specifically their peers and some of my colleagues, to implore them to create a space for, acknowledge, and let them grieve, to not task these students with explaining or proving their fatigue, and to learn why George Floyd's murder and all the other names we've seen since Emmett Till was traumatic. It felt less than what was needed as a response. It felt really inferior to the rage and pain that I felt and that was shared with me. But I felt this desire to protect them in the way that I would want to be protected. I felt a desire for them to receive empathy and grace. I really wanted action. I desperately wanted movement. And I was so tired of silence as a response. So when I addressed my program, it really felt like a Holy Spirit movement, the kind that just kind of welled up inside of you, right? And you kind of wrestle with it and presses against you until you really can't do anything but surrender. I really just wanted to give my students permission to be human, the way that I was given permission when former students of our program reached out to me to ask about the environment on campus and how my heart was responding, the same way my mom did when she sat next to me and grieved with me in the following weeks. I wanted to challenge these students' peers to hold them and to take responsibility for their own knowledge and privilege for not experiencing an impact. I just wanted to model to my students that their lives mattered. Since then, I've held numerous conversations with students, ABC and others, with colleagues about America's ugly secret of racism and what it looks like in present day. Now, our program responded by engaging in more dialogue, going on a racial reconciliation walk with thousands of other individuals from various churches and nonprofit organizations in the local area, and also creating a process group experience for people to continue to think about their reactions and feelings or lack thereof. I felt encouraged, but also very frustrated by our response, mainly trying to answer this constant question of like, why did it take so long for you to believe? Most recently, I was fortunate to have this opportunity to be on a panel for our annual Black America event that focused on self-care, the impact of 2020, and the impact of seeing images like George Floyd streaming across social media outlets. It was during my conversation with one of our alum and also with a student that I realized how much of my focus has really been on providing support and care to my students, putting myself and my own process on the back burner. I was surprised at how quickly the pain of 2020 just welled up inside of me. And I recognized that my determination to uplift my students and their process, working really hard to create a space for them, I did not ask for space for myself. My boss extended space to me, so I took what was offered, but I did not work to protect myself while trying to protect my students. This past month in particular has really reminded me that I cannot mentor or be a role model if I do not demand the same space to be human for myself that I do for my students. That is being a role model, demanding self-care and protecting myself so I can thrive and not simply survive is being an advocate for social justice. That is modeling to my students that our lives matter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Page, for sharing with us. We'll call on Dr. Wang next, if you would, to go ahead and tell us some of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Page, as well, and grateful for this opportunity. And as you all know, these last several years have been exceedingly challenging for all of us here in our country, as well as around the world, struggling with a global pandemic, political tension and strife, social as well as racial unrest, most notably brought about by the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, among just too many others. And what's in particular, what's been weighing heavily on my heart has been the response, or in some cases, the lack thereof, of the church and of Christian communities to much of what is happening in our world and in our country. And I know this isn't the case for all Christians here in America, but as a professor in a Christian university, unfortunately, I've seen too many Christians disengaged, or even worse, like subtly and not so subtly contributing to the problem by either denying the problem of racism in our country or by even over spiritualizing the problem. And it's not that I'm resistant or ashamed to bring God into this conversation. I'm still a pastor, and it is my natural disposition to bring God into everything because he is central to life. But the problem with over spiritualizing is that it makes this matter, it makes it largely a matter of talking about the problem in the abstract, as if the problem can be resolved if we just have the right perspective on the situation. Like the goal of it is for us to think correctly or for us to think Christianly about the situation. But the tragedy of this is that we're struggling with this kind of thinking while our brothers and sisters, their lived reality is being neglected. And this is a reality that I take part in as well. And this is a lived reality that's been going on for much longer than just these last 4 or 5 years. And it's a lived reality that Christians, I believe, have not adequately listened to, despite us being a profession about listening. And as an Asian American myself, many others who look like me have also recently become more focused targets of racial animosity and violence as well. And as I reflect on my own vulnerability to racial animosity, I'm coming to terms with the hypocrisy and the sinfulness in my own Asian American community, how we have benefited from the blood, sweat, and tears of the Black community as they've fought for civil rights in this country for decades, for centuries, while many of us, including Asian American Christians, largely stayed on the sidelines when it came to supporting and fighting for the civil rights of other communities of color here in America. And over the last decade, I've gone on my own journey and have come to my own conclusion that it is time for people that look like me, and including myself, to do my fair share as well. So in addition to supporting and advocacy work with students and students of color within kind of one-to-one contexts behind closed doors, because a lot of times that's the context where these kind of conversations happen, I've been a lot more intentional about doing more support and advocacy work in public, even as a vulnerable, non-tenured new assistant professor at a theologically conservative evangelical university, because there are risks involved in this kind of work. So for example, my family took part in Black Lives Matter's protests, and we were open about it, talking about it in class and conversations on social media. And part of the reason why we've done this is because I want students to know that they have professors who are not only unashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but they're also unashamed of their support of BLM, and they're also unashamed of the affirmation that racial injustice exists and is pervasive, and we're unashamed that in our belief that our Christian faith teaches us that we are implicated in the plight of our neighbor, and we're implicated in the plight of our fellow brothers and sisters, and that in the plight that is also part of my own story as a child who grew up in a family of immigrants as well. And our response to racial injustice, and my closing point is that our response to racial injustice in Black Lives Matter needs to encompass not only individual interventions behind closed doors. Those are critically important, but we have to take the next step, which includes more systems level interventions as well. And I don't have time to go into this in adequate detail, but I just want to share a few examples of some of the areas that myself and many of my colleagues have been pressing into. First, we're pressing into issues that impact our overall program of clinical training, addressing systematic trends that potentially pathologize or impose bias against students of color. Did you know that oftentimes students of color will more commonly receive feedback like that they lack empathy, you know? And I don't believe, is it that it's actually the case that these students lack empathy? It might actually be the case that perhaps there's something about the rubric, something about the system that is looking for a specific expression or definition of empathy that might in fact be quite culturally encapsulated. Second, we're also pressing into issues not related not only to student admissions to make sure that our admissions process is unbiased and values diversity, but also to the intentional hiring of a diverse faculty, because I know many of our programs, including the program I come from, we don't presently have a Black faculty member. And for a long time, we don't have Black clinical supervisors at our counseling center. And that is to our detriment of the whole entire community, not just the students of color that are trained to become psychologists. And my last point is that racial equality also needs to be in our research agenda as well. It needs to inform our understanding and our scholarship, even on matters relating to integration. And that's why, as editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology, in partnership with colleagues such as John McConnell over at Wheaton and Leah Fortson at Azusa Pacific, we recently launched a call for papers for a special issue of JPT on multiculturalism, social justice, and peace within the integration of psychology and theology. And within this special issue, we're calling for research on Christian theologies of liberation and justice, on Black theology, on Latinx theologies, with implications on research and practice on the decolonization of and globalization of theology and psychology. And as far as I can tell, this is going to be the first of its kind in an integration journal such as JPT. And my hope is that it's not going to be the last. So again, just this idea that we need to take this, address this issue on multiple fronts in all the different facets of our scope of practice as Christian psychologists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. That was great. Dr. Jones.
Yes, thank you so much for being here to the audience, and thank you all for the opportunity. I'm grateful that we're all here in this space talking about our experiences. I'm encouraged by the community of folks who feel the call to respond. I've been thinking about this in my multiple roles. Outside of my professorial role, I own a private practice and consultation practice called Dear Dr. Jones, Therapy and Consulting. And there, in addition to working with children and adolescents, I serve individuals with historically marginalized identities. And so needless to say, there have been a number of opportunities in the past few months to discuss the topic at hand. Between students, clients, and peers, I've heard so many reactions, from anger to despair to fear. For my white and more visibly privileged students, the questions are related to beginnings. Where do I start? How do I jump in? What do I do with the new bad feelings? I have an urge to retreat into my identities of privilege or into silence. For my students of color and my more visibly marginalized clients, the questions have been almost exclusively about endings. When will it end? And I find myself caught in the middle of navigating my own fears, angers, and bad feelings, while being expected to have answers to the questions that I am myself asking. I'm so grateful for initiatives that have brought attention to the traumatic stress of racism, the impacts of this stress on student performance and well-being, the roles of us as psychologists in bringing awareness to and alleviating individual stress, while also attending to our roles among systems and structures that help to build up racism. I'm grateful for the topic of this conference. And so, for example, among our School of Psychology and Counseling and Nursing faculty, we've held a discussion over the past few weeks using the book Be the Bridge by Latasha Morrison, where we're examining a biblical model of racial reconciliation. And so while this work is just beginning and we're all in different positions when it comes toward moving toward an anti-racist, Christ-like vision of relationship with one another, I do value the fact that our dean has led us in this initiative. I'm grateful that the author of the book is a dark-skinned Black woman like me, an image all too absent in academia, although a large percentage of us have doctoral degrees. And yet, in these very groups, we have a chance to embody this process of racial reconciliation. And it becomes difficult when it's time for the rubber to meet the road. As an example, in one of our small group sessions, I shared a recent stressful event that I encountered with police. I shared not for the purpose of receiving emotional support, but to really concretize and provide a real life, recent example of the conversations we were having around racism and the ways that it can play out. And not surprisingly, the reactions that I got from my colleagues of color, my white colleagues, were to ask what solutions I had considered, or to talk about how immobilized they felt. What I didn't receive was an example of lament, which was the topic of what that we had been discussing as a group. A biblical oriented position of lament, which leads us to repentance. And so these reactions are an example of the request that I've implicitly and explicitly been making throughout the year, and that I continue to make to each of us, is to take a collective sense of responsibility for navigating, embodying, and also vocally leading these conversations. I think all too often the responsibility falls upon the individuals with the most visibly marginalized identities to initiate the conversations, and then also to model what they look like in real life and in practical application. And so it's easy then to dismiss these topics as the pet projects of those who talk about them the most, or as their favorite topics, because they're isolated in bringing them up. However, when we join collectively, each taking responsibility for embodying social justice or anti-racism, or just a Christ-like perspective in our clinical roles and in our academic roles, when we're all able to do that, it becomes much more difficult to dismiss. And in fact, we then are agents in changing the culture in our various spaces toward a culture that, like Christ, dismantled systems of empire that did not build us up toward God. So that's my encouragement, that's my request, is that each of us in our unique roles would consider how we can join with one another to take on collective responsibility.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Really appreciate this. Dr. Girguis, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, and it is wonderful to be here with you all. As I think about my personal reactions specifically to the police killings in 2020 and Black Lives Matter reminding us of the incredibly long history of racism, the original sin of the country that we now live in, I reflect on my own identity as a child of immigrants. My parents immigrated here from Egypt, and being born in the United States, being cisgender male, so having both experiences of discrimination as well as experiences of privilege and power. I wrestle with, and I know many who are people of color who are not Black wrestle with what our response has been and how has that been woefully inadequate at times, and what our response should be. And I think about how we fall into the all or nothing thinking when it comes to, have I done enough? Have I not done enough? Is the discrimination that we've experienced the same as the discrimination that our Black brothers and sisters have experienced? I think of the number of times I was pulled over as a kid by cops. I think about the discrimination I experienced after 9/11, and I think about how that is still qualitatively different than my Black brother, who was also pulled over by a cop when he was a teenager, but had a gun pointed at him, and I didn't have a gun pointed at me. And as Dr. Jones just said, the lament that should bring up for us as people of faith around what the systems that we have benefited from, and then how can we, I would say, stand in solidarity, whether we are white majority culture, whether we are people of color who may have our own experiences of discrimination and even racism, but still at other times benefit from a system of white superiority? How do we wrestle with all that? How do we not put the onus on our Black brothers and sisters as if they have to be the ones to carry us forward in this quest for racial justice? Personally, that's what I wrestle with, all of that. I want to talk a little bit about how the institution I'm a part of, Azusa Pacific University, has responded to this, because I think it highlights a very important point, and that is this quest for racial justice, this quest for justice as people of faith, is not a destination. It is a lifelong trajectory. It is nothing that we can move towards it, but as Dr. Martin Luther King said, you know, the arc of the universe, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so being able to commit to doing this work for the lifetime, for the kingdom of heaven that is both now, but is not yet realized, that is what we are about. So I think about my institution, APU, and I think about how, you know, we have had diversity and justice as one of our special emphases, with integration of faith and spirituality and with systems thinking. And how we have 4 diversity classes. And one of those diversity classes is a class that looks back on the history of systemic injustices in the United States, looking at employment, looking at housing, looking at education, looking at all the ways that the disparities have been concretized over time. And I am proud of that. I am proud that we are having that conversation with our students. I should say that our student body is very diverse. APU is obviously a Christian institution, but because we are open enrollment, because students have not had to sign statements of faith, especially in our psychology programs, there's a lot of both racial and ethnic and cultural diversity, but also religious diversity. And so I think about half of my students don't identify as Christian, and that provides a really rich opportunity to talk about integration of faith and spirituality, as well as diversity and justice. Yet, even with all that, I am reflecting on 2020 and how difficult it was. And we have a student-led diversity committee that we've had for a very long time. And yet a number of our Black students came to us and said, we would like to start our own affinity group. We would like to start the Association of Black Psychology Students within the psychology programs at APU. And it was interesting because I, to be very honest, had to fight off the defensiveness of, but aren't we already on that trajectory? Aren't we already going there? And by the grace of God, I think the faculty were able to pause and to listen, because our Black students were telling us, hey, we need additional support. There are additional ways that the program is not helping us optimize our learning. There are additional ways that the program is missing us. And so to sit in that conversation with them, and I'm so grateful to those students. I'm so grateful that they came to us with that they shared with us very specific ways that we could continue decolonizing the curriculum, that we could continue decentering the whiteness that is inherent to psychology. And by having that ongoing dialogue with those students, I think we make our program better for everyone. I think we really do then move towards a program that seeks justice, right? As a faith-based institution, I absolutely think we need to have an unapologetic theology around justice and righteousness that go hand in hand. And that is missing. That is missing in many white evangelical institutions. And so we need to learn from our Black brothers and sisters around that. And then we need to be able to own that in what we do. And so all this to say, I think as I reflect both personally, you know, as an administrator within the PsyD program at APU, as I think professionally about the support that I hope I can offer our students of color, especially our Black students. I think it's so important for us to be inviting students into the conversation and not letting it be some kind of top down, we have the answers, we're going to tell you what to do. That's a hard fine line because we don't want to put the onus back on our students, to fix the problem, but we want to make sure that we hear them and that we are listening to them. And we need to acknowledge the ways that we fall short, the ways that we have missed it, the ways that we think we've been doing it but not been doing it, and then we need to act. We need to be able to say, yes, we as your faculty, we as a program, whatever it might be, we as psychologists who are Christian are going to be in solidarity. We are going to move towards justice because that's what our Lord calls us to. That's what the kingdom of God calls us to.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. We'll be hearing from Winston Seegobin, Dr. Winston Seegobin, and Dr. John McConnell next. Thank you very much.
I am delighted today to be invited to be a part of this panel at the CAPS convention on engaging students in Black Lives Matter and civil rights concerns. I am Winston Seegobin. I'm a professor of clinical psychology and also the director of diversity in the Graduate School of Clinical Psychology at George Fox University. Last summer, after the death of George Floyd, as a faculty, we sent out a statement to our students expressing our concerns about African Americans in our community and in our country and ways that we can support Black Lives Matter. At that point in time, we also developed a goal of becoming an anti-racist program and developed some core values which we wanted to be a part of our program. These core values include all students, faculty, and staff feel valued and welcomed in our community. All students experience equity in the sharing of resources in the community. Histories of all students are honored, valued, and included in the curriculum and discussions. Issues are discussed with compassion and care for all and highlighted alongside all other core values in the program. We want to move from a white-centered, majority-centered curriculum to a diverse and Christ-centered curriculum in our classes and in our relationships. And faculty will lead the way in these changes. We also want to create a culture of diversity throughout the program. The department and the curriculum, where students are taught how to do therapy, assessment, consultation, research, and teaching from a culturally informed perspective. We also want an evaluation of our progress toward our goals through internal and external partners annually. We also want to provide a space for racial healing in our community. This will be accomplished by a Christ-centered lament, confession, forgiveness, and reconciliation throughout the program. Our goal is over the next few years that we would have ongoing assessment and acknowledgement of racism and racist acts in our community and be able to work on those. We also want to focus on decolonization and decentering whiteness in our program, in our curriculum, in clinical psychology, as well as the way in which our program is experienced by our students. Our ultimate goal is to be an anti-racist program. Toward that goal, last fall, our faculty began reading the book called Be the Bridge by Latasha Morrison. And every month, one of our faculty meetings is devoted to discussion of this book, where we talk about the importance of lament, confession, forgiveness, and reconciliation, and the importance of that happening with us as a faculty as well as with our students in our program. We really want our students to understand that Black Lives Matter and that civil rights concerns are very important in our program. And I'm so glad for the opportunity to be able to share these in this panel at the CAPS conference.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jennifer Ripley, and I will be doing a discussant of the Black Lives Matter and Civil Rights panel discussion. I apologize that Dr. John McConnell was not able to be included after all in this presentation, so you didn't miss him. He was not able to be included this time. I was struck, first of all, by Dr. Girguis's idea that this is a lifelong trajectory, and that each of the presenters talked about this as a lifelong journey towards justice and towards civil rights that began long, long ago and is in the heart of Christ. I was struck by the personal identity. For me as a Caucasian woman, to be able to share in what it means to be a person of color, and the personal identity that is reacted to by others, the desire to mentor and educate students, particularly Dr. Page talking about a strong desire to mentor students who are novices, and then peers, as we heard from Dr. Jones about educating peers about issues of race as well, and that there are a lot of expectations around that, and that being a real theme in terms of both student expectations as students of color, as well as less aware or less marginalized students having different needs and expectations, and then negotiating that with institutional expectations and our positions as faculty members. There was a good discussion about kind of various levels as well of response. Local events like panel discussions that Dr. Page had been a part of, or national events that Dr. Girguis had been a part of, Dr. Wang's special issue in the journal, GPT, and these being positive, professional endeavors that I believe will be helpful to not only those who are immediately receiving them, but also a wave of response within those that are touched by that. I was also struck with Dr. Jones remembering her clients, and for the vast majority of CAPS members I know are engaged in clinical work, and how important it is to include that as part of our professional endeavors and the ways in which we think about our work. And finally, at the program level, I was struck that unbeknownst to us, two different programs, both George Fox and Regent, are reading the Be the Bridge book by Latasha Morrison this year, and doing it as a group of faculty who are together working through racial reconciliation from a Christian perspective, and that this was striking and might be something that other programs or faculty might consider also doing a kind of book club as we are around that book, which is truly excellent. I'm about halfway through it right now, and it is a truly excellent book from a Christian perspective and very personable. That there's personal response, but there's also program level response. So there were organizational activities such as George Fox's statement that they gave after George Floyd, and panel discussion that Dr. Page has been a part of. And then larger issues of structure and values, such as Winston Seegobin talked about with their program, and the values that they had created that he shared with us. So very glad to have been a part of coordinating this and to learn from these experts in diversity. Thank you.